Hello and welcome back to our second week of Discriminating Taste.
Just a quick word before we get into the heart of our subject this week. I wanted to give some information about the intro music. This piece is called Marche pour la cérémonie des Turcs, or March for the Ceremony of the Turks. And it was composed by Jean-Baptiste Lully.
Here on the left we see the statue of Jean-Baptiste Lully. This statue is at the Palais Garnier, which is the Paris Opera. It was begun by Louis XIV under the leadership of Lully. It was officially renamed the Académie Royale de Musique, but now is known just typically as the Opéra.
I hope you enjoy it. It's a very majestic piece, and it's actually a bit rare in that it's a ceremonial piece, but it's written in a minor key. It was composed actually for the play about tacky social climbing, Molière's Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, or The Would-Be Noble, from which I read last week. Little is known for absolute sure about the life of the composer Lully. He left virtually no correspondence behind him from which we might glean more definitive information.
However, as we can tell from this sign outside of the Hôtel Lully, this was where he lived in Paris. It's right north of the theater of the Palais Royal. And from the inscription, we can tell that the outside of his house was covered in trumpets, guitars, cornets, and all types of decorations demonstrating his abilities as a musician.
But the rumors surrounding him were rampant. He was born in Florence in 1632 and came to Paris as a very young man to serve Mademoiselle de Montpensier, otherwise known as La Grande Mademoiselle, who was the second highest ranking lady in France after the Queen, who had decided that she would like someone around to help her with her Italian. Just as an aside, we mentioned her last week. She was the great salon hostess who saved the rebel army of the Fronde and its leaders, the Grand Condé, by turning the Bastille's cannons on the royal army. Lully claimed noble heritage, but almost no one believed him, especially after a rather shabby old man showed up at court claiming to be his father, a mill worker, whom Lully quietly sent back to Florence. This family matter was not the only awkward moment his claim to high birth would cause him. Like when Louis XIV offered to confer nobility upon him. What was Lully to do? Did he accept and therefore admit that he would become something that he had only pretended to be before? Or reject the offer, refusing to accept a status that he claimed was already his? In the end, he counteroffered, suggesting that he be given an official title as secretary to the king, one that would presuppose the nobility of its office holder. Louis XIV consented, and Lully got straight to work on his coat of arms, which would drip in silver, gold, and azure. For it cannot be denied that Lully was a bit of a social climber. He invented himself. Sure, he did it through political maneuvering, gossip, calumny, and backstabbing, but most of all, he did it through music. For in fact, scholars today agree Lully had likely been a street urchin in Florence, an entertaining ragamuffin that the Florentines had recommended to the uncle of Mademoiselle de Montpensier as a fun Florentine gift. At 14, then, Lully was in Paris, starting out in the kitchens of the Grande Mademoiselle, a total nobody, but someone who, like Louis XIV, would slowly weave around himself through song and dance a body of legend and myth that would make him larger than life, a musician who would obscure all prior musicians, and a man who would create the sound of France. From what goldmine of imagination and energy did Lully source the will to move himself from the gutters of Florence through the rigid social hierarchy of France and erect himself as god of the dance and inventor of the French opera? That is likely a never-ending question. However, it should be noted that on the evening of Louis XIV's premiere as king, when the 14-year-old monarch danced as the Sun King for the first time during the 12-hour nighttime ballet that shuttered the ugly period of civil war and symbolized a mythical rebirth of France, its power to move from the darkness to light, the sinful to the sacred, the dancing Lully was noticed by the king for the first time. Thematic questions for this week. How does emotion affect taste? Number 2, how does reason affect taste? Number 3, this is the hard one. Last week we mentioned the medieval hierarchy of the soul. At the bottom were the passions or feelings. In the middle was imagination, which was thought to communicate between the passions and reason. And at the top was reason. How do you think this idea of the soul shifted given the transformations of 18th century taste that we will now go over?
This week, we are going to begin looking at the way that taste began to be defined during the Enlightenment period. The 18th century saw a great flurry of theorizations on just about everything: art, music, emotions, and especially taste. The art of living had reached its most iconic height under the reign of Louis XIV, and now that he was gone, everyone seemed interested in the science behind this art. Montesquieu put forth the most heralded theory on taste during the 18th century, but just as last time we discussed the castle of the ill-fated finance minister Nicolas Fouquet at Vaux-le-Vicomte as the pattern that Louis XIV would follow, so too we must discuss the Abbé Dubos in order to better understand the philosophical revolutions around taste in the 18th century. Like Fouquet in some ways, the work of the Abbé Dubos was highly influential, but largely forgotten following his disappearance. Jean-Baptiste Dubos was born in 1670 in the town of Beauvais, which is north of Paris, and if you ever happen to go to Beauvais, I would recommend visiting their church there. They have actually the second largest dome in all of Europe after Brunelleschi's cathedral in Florence, and it is amazing. He was born in 1670 in Beauvais and died 1742 in Paris. He was known as the Abbé Dubos, abbé meaning it's a lower level clergyman, what we call an abbot. He was not just a clergyman, however. He had studied theology in Paris, but he soon dedicated himself to the law and spent his career as a very, very successful diplomat. He was a friend of writers such as Boileau, scholars and philosophers like Pierre Bayle and John Locke, and generally kept the pulse of intellectual progress in Europe, and especially in the arts. The arts were of the utmost importance to Dubos's political thought. What we would call arts and letters were considered by Dubos as the basic principles for all civilized social life. The arts and letters, in a way, invented humanity for Dubos, because it was through their mediation that mutual understandings, duties, and relationships existed among citizens. In more modern terms, we might say that for Dubos, the arts and letters were those domains that organized the chaos of information or data around us into hierarchies of meaning that in turn allowed a society to form and function. As a side note, if the idea of art as paradigm for and creative of social feeling and expression is something that interests you, I would recommend the work of philosopher and art critic Richard Wollheim.